Alice stood barefoot in the biting wind of a sudden, brutal winter, watching the iron bolt slide home with the finality of a cracking jawbone. There were no dramatic farewells or screams, only the hollow thud of oak meeting stone. Her family hadn't just locked her out to teach her a lesson, they had left her to freeze to death. Yet beneath the shadows of the ancient trees, the deep woods were watching, and they had no intention of letting their own simply go to waste. The door was rough-hewn oak, studded with black iron nails. Alice knew every knot and splinter of it. She had scrubbed it clean of mud in the spring, oiled its hinges in the autumn, and leaned her forehead against it when her father's funeral procession had disappeared over the snowy ridge 3 years ago. Now she was on the wrong side of it. She didn't pound her fists against the wood. She didn't scream her brother's name. Cynicism had always been her armor against the quiet cruelty of her family, and even now, as the snow began to settle on the thin linen of her collar, she refused to give them the satisfaction of her begging. Through the thick timber, she could hear the muffled, frantic whispering of Garrett and his wife, Catelyn. "She's a blight." Catelyn's voice carried sharp and thin like a wire. "Since she was born, the crops rot in the soil. The well freezes solid. We barely have enough grain to feed ourselves, Garrett. The winter will take us all if we keep feeding the bastard." Garrett didn't argue. He hadn't argued since Catelyn brought her dowry of 3 fat pigs and a chest of silver into their rotting home. His silence was heavier than the falling snow. Alice pressed her palm flat against the freezing wood. It was already sapping the heat from her skin. So this is it, she thought. No executioner's block, no dramatic trial, just a locked door and a cold night. Ironridge was a merciless place, even in the height of summer. Clinging to the edge of the jagged northern mountains, it was a village built by desperate people who had nowhere else to go. The wind sweeping down from the peaks carried a chill that never truly left the marrow of your bones. Tonight, however, the temperature was plummeting with a vicious, sudden intent. The air felt heavy, choked with ice crystals that stung her cheeks and caught in her eyelashes. Alice stepped back from the door. Her bare feet sank into the fresh powder. The pain was immediate, a sharp, burning agony radiating from her toes, up her ankles and into her calves. She was wearing nothing but a grey, spun-wool dress and a frayed shawl that belonged to her dead mother. She looked at the small, square window of the cottage. A warm, flickering orange light spilled out onto the snowbank, painting a mockery of a hearth fire on the ice. Inside, Garrett was probably already pulling his chair closer to the flames, rubbing his hands together trying to wash away the guilt. Catelyn would be stirring the thin barley stew, calculating how many more days the sack of grain would last, now that the bastard blight was gone. Alice turned her back on the light. The village of Ironridge was silent. The other cottages were shut tight, their windows shuttered and barred. The villagers were survivors, which meant they minded their own business. If a man chose to lock his half-sister out in a blizzard, it was a family matter. To intervene was to take on another mouth to feed. Compassion was a luxury the starving could not afford. The wind howled a low, guttural sound that rattled the shingles of the roofs. Alice wrapped her arms around herself, burying her hands in her armpits. The burning in her feet was beginning to fade, replaced by a dull, heavy numbness. That was worse, she knew. When the pain stopped, the flesh was dying. She needed shelter. The stables. She trudged through the knee-deep drifts toward the back of the property. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, making her chest ache with every shallow breath. The snow crunched loudly beneath her numb feet. It felt as though she were walking on broken glass, yet she couldn't feel the cuts. She reached the stable door and threw her weight against it. It didn't budge. She rattled the iron handle. A heavy padlock clattered against the wood. Catelyn had thought of everything. She hadn't just locked Alice out of the house, she had locked her out of the warmth of the beasts, too. The pigs, the lone draft horse, they were allowed shelter. Alice was not. A sudden violent shiver racked her body so hard it rattled her teeth. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the rough timber of the stable wall. The wood scraped her cheek, leaving a smear of blood that froze almost instantly. "Damn you, Garrett!" she whispered. The words plumed into the air in a thick white cloud, snatched away by the wind before they could even reach her ears. She looked past the property line. Beyond the low stone wall lay the edge of the deep woods, a sprawling ancient forest of towering pines and suffocating shadows. It was a place where hunters went in heavily armed parties of 10 and often returned as parties of 6. It was a place of wolves, huge, unnatural things that left tracks the size of dinner plates. But about a mile into the tree line, there was an old logger's shack, a half-collapsed lean-to where the men used to store their axes. It had a partial roof. It blocked the wind. It was madness to walk into the woods at night during a blizzard unarmed and freezing, but standing in the yard meant dying a slow, pathetic death while Catelyn watched from the window. If she was going to die, Alice decided with a surge of cynical defiance she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of finding her corpse on their doorstep in the morning. Let them wonder. Let them fear the woods took her, and let them fear the woods would give her back. She pushed off the stable wall, forcing her deadened legs to move, and stepped over the low stone boundary. She walked into the dark. The forest swallowed her immediately. The wind, which had been a screaming force in the open fields of the village, was broken by the massive, thick trunks of the ancient pines. Here it was a low, mournful sigh that whipped through the canopy high above. But the absence of the biting wind did not mean warmth. The cold in the deep woods was different. It was still. It was heavy. It seeped into Alice's skin like dark water. She lost track of time. Every step required a monumental act of will. Lift the heavy, numb block of flesh that used to be her leg. Push it forward through the waist-high snowdrifts. Shift her weight. Repeat. Her mind began to play cruel tricks. The cynical edge that had propelled her away from the village was eroding, replaced by the strange, lethargic euphoria of severe hypothermia. The shivering had stopped. That was a bad sign, her rational mind screamed, but the rest of her felt bizarrely calm. She looked down at her hands. They were bone white, the nails turning a sickly shade of blue, but they didn't hurt. They just felt disconnected. Just a little further, she told herself. The logging shack is just past the ridge. But the ridge never came. The woods all looked the same, a dizzying fractal of black bark and white snow. The moon, a pale sliver of silver, broke through the heavy clouds for a brief moment, casting long skeletal shadows across the forest floor. Alice tripped over a buried root. She didn't put her hands out to catch herself. She just let herself fall. The impact was muffled by the deep snow. She lay there on her side, her cheek pressed against the freezing powder. It felt comfortable. Why had she been fighting so hard the snow was like a featherbed? If she just closed her eyes for a minute, just gathered her strength, she could get up and keep walking. Yes, just a moment of rest. She curled her knees toward her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins. A warm, golden hallucination began to bloom behind her closed eyelids. She was back in the kitchen before Catelyn came. Her father was stoking the hearth. The smell of roasting mutton and rosemary filled the air. Garrett was laughing at a joke. She felt a phantom warmth spreading through her chest, lulling her into a deep, dangerous sleep. Crunch. The sound was sharp and heavy. It broke through the hallucination like a stone shattering a pane of glass. Alice snapped her eyes open. The golden warmth vanished, replaced instantly by the brutal, stinging reality of the ice. She lay perfectly still, her breath held in her throat. Crunch, crunch, footsteps. But not human. The rhythm was wrong. It was four-legged, deliberate, slow. The sound of something large displacing a massive amount of snow with every step. Alice forced her heavy head to lift. Her neck protested, the muscles stiff and frozen. She peered through the gloom, past the trunk of the pine tree she had fallen next to. 10 yards away, standing perfectly still in a patch of moonlight, was a wolf. It was monstrous, a nightmare of muscle and fur. Its shoulders stood taller than Alice's waist. Its coat was a mottled, filthy grey, matted with ice and dried blood. But it was the eyes that paralyzed her. They weren't the flat, instinctual eyes of a wild animal. They were intelligent. They were calculating. They were amber, glowing faintly in the dark. Alice didn't scream. Her throat was too dry, her body too broken. She simply watched as the beast lowered its massive head, sniffing the air. It was smelling the metallic tang of her blood where she had scraped her cheek. It was smelling her impending death. Then a second shape emerged from the trees to her left. Darker, sleeker, but just as impossibly large. Then a third. They didn't snarl. They didn't rush her. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out to form a loose perimeter around her fallen body. They were flanking her. So Alice thought a bitter smile touching her cracked lips. Not the cold after all. Catelyn was right. I do draw the wolves. She rolled onto her back, a monumental effort that left her gasping. She looked up at the canopy, the black branches weaving a net against the dark, grey sky. She waited for the teeth. She waited for the tearing of flesh. She hoped it would be quick. She hoped the numbness in her limbs would hold out just long enough so she wouldn't feel them pulling her apart. But the attack didn't come. Instead, the 3 massive wolves sat back on their haunches. They were waiting. The air shifted. The scent of pine and freezing dirt was suddenly overpowered by something else. Something heavy, metallic, and overwhelming. It smelled like a thunderstorm. It smelled like raw ozone and hot copper. The 3 wolves lowered their heads, tucking their muzzles toward their chests in a posture of unmistakable submission. From the deepest shadow of the woods, a 4th figure stepped into the moonlight. Alice's breath hitched. This one was different. It dwarfed the others. Its fur was pitch black, a void that seemed to absorb the scant moonlight. Frost clung to the tips of its guard hairs, giving it a ghost-like halo. As it moved, the muscles beneath its pelt rolled like boulders under a dark river. It stopped a few feet from where Alice lay. The sheer heat radiating from the beast's massive body washed over her. It was so intense it made the snow around its paws sizzle and melt. The black wolf looked down at her. Its eyes were not amber. They were a piercing, terrifying ice blue. Alice met its gaze. She didn't look away. If she was going to be meat, she would look her butcher in the eye. "Get it over with," she croaked. Her voice was barely a whisper, broken and raspy. "I'm already dead anyway." The black wolf tilted its head. A low, rumbling sound vibrated in its chest. It wasn't a growl. It was almost a sigh. Then the nightmare truly began. The giant black wolf did not lunge. It did not bare its fangs. Instead, it planted its massive front paws in the snow and shuddered violently. Alice watched, horrified and mesmerized, as the creature began to tear itself apart. There was no magical glow, no smooth, mystical transition. It was violent, ugly, and sickeningly real. The sound of thick bones cracking and snapping echoed loudly in the silent forest. The beast let out a low, guttural roar that morphed halfway through into a distinctly human groan of agony. Its spine arched unnaturally, the dark fur receding, melting into pale skin. Shoulders dislocated and reformed with wet popping sounds. The elongated snout flattened, the jawbone breaking and resetting itself in seconds. Steam billowed off the shifting mass of flesh, a thick cloud of heat meeting the freezing air. Blood hissed as it hit the snow. Alice tried to scramble backward, her primal survival instinct finally kicking in, overriding the hypothermia. Her numb arms betrayed her, slipping in the slush. When the steam cleared, the beast was gone. In its place knelt a man. He was entirely naked, seemingly impervious to the biting cold. He was massive, built like a fortress of scarred muscle and thick sinew. His skin was pale, crisscrossed with jagged white scars that told stories of 100 brutal wars. Long, pitch-black hair, damp with sweat, and melting frost clung to his broad shoulders and hung over his face. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he recovered from the trauma of the shift. Slowly he lifted his head. His eyes were the same terrifying ice blue. He looked at Alice. He looked at her blue lips, her frost-bitten fingers, the pathetic thinness of her woolen dress. His jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck stood out like thick cords. He didn't say a word. He reached out with a hand that was twice the size of hers, his knuckles thick and calloused. Alice flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, expecting a blow. Instead, she felt heat. Scorching, impossible heat against her cheek. His hand was resting against the side of her face, right over the freezing scrape. His touch was rough, smelling of blood and pine, but it was so warm it made her gasp. The contrast between the deadly cold in her blood and the furnace-like heat of his skin sent a violent shockwave through her nervous system. "Open your eyes," he commanded. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't the voice of a man who asked. It was the voice of a man who commanded entire armies. Alice forced her eyes open. She was shaking again, her body reacting to the sudden influx of warmth. He studied her face. He noted the shape of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes, and the desperate, cynical fire that still flickered faintly in her stare. He traced the line of her cheekbone with a heavy thumb. "Ironridge." He stated his voice flat. He didn't ask where she was from. He knew. The stench of the miserable little village was likely still on her clothes. "They locked the door." Alice managed to push the words out her teeth, chattering so violently she bit her own tongue. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. "Garrett locked it." The man's eyes darkened. A shadow passed over his features, something wild and untamed that belonged to the Black Wolf. "A pack that turns on its own is no pack at all," he murmured. He stood up. The sheer size of him was intimidating. He towered over her, a dark monolith against the white snow. He turned his head towards the three wolves who were still sitting in obedient silence. He let out a sharp, clicking sound from the back of his throat. Instantly, one of the grey wolves trotted forward. It held something in its massive jaws. A heavy, thick bundle of dark fur. It dropped it at the man's feet and backed away immediately. The man shook the bundle out. It was a massive cloak fashioned from the pelt of some enormous dark beast, lined with thick, insulating wool. He knelt back down, sweeping the heavy cloak around Alice's trembling shoulders. The moment the fur settled over her, it was as if she had been plunged into a hot bath. The cloak retained his immense body heat. It smelled intensely of him musk, wood smoke, and rain. He didn't just drape it over her, he carefully tucked the edges around her legs, wrapping her like a cocoon. "Why?" Alice whispered, her voice cracking. In her world, no one did anything for nothing. Kindness was a transaction. "What do you want?" The man paused. His ice-blue eyes met hers, stripping away the layers of her cynicism in a single glance. He wasn't looking at a broken, frozen girl. He was looking at something he had been searching for. "I am Gideon," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a terrifying, absolute authority. "King of the Wintermark, and I do not leave what is mine to freeze in the mud." Before Alice could process the sheer absurdity of the statement, he slid his massive arms beneath her. One arm supported her back, the other scooped under her knees. He lifted her effortlessly, standing up in the deep snow, as if she weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. Her head lolled against his bare chest. His skin was burning hot, his heartbeat slow, steady, and loud like a war drum. Gideon turned his gaze back toward the direction of Ironridge. The village was invisible through the trees and the blizzard, but he knew exactly where it was. The three wolves flanked him, their amber eyes fixed on the distant settlement. "Sleep, little bird," Gideon murmured into her hair. His tone was strangely gentle, but the look on his face was pure murder. "When you wake, you will never be cold again, and the ones who closed that door will never see another spring. He began to walk deeper into the forest, carrying her into the dark. The blizzard howled around them, but in his arms Alice finally closed her eyes, the cynical survivalist in her surrendering completely to the terrifying, consuming heat of the Alpha King. The return to the living was not a gentle awakening. It was a brutal, agonizing crawl. Alice first became aware of the pain. It started as a dull throb in her extremities, radiating from her toes and fingertips before escalating into a screaming, burning sensation. It felt as though someone had submerged her hands and feet in boiling oil. She tried to thrash to pull away from the source of the agony, but her limbs felt like lead. "Hold her down. If she kicks the blankets off, she'll go into shock." The voice was female, rough as unpolished granite. Strong hands gripped Alice's shoulders, pinning her flat against something soft. Alice gasped, her eyes flying open. The blinding whiteness of the blizzard was gone. She was staring up at a vaulted ceiling of dark, smoke-stained timber. The air in the room was suffocatingly hot, thick with the smell of burning peat, roasting meat, and crushed herbs. She wasn't dead. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought a surge of cynical panic. She was alive, which meant she was somewhere, and in her experience, being somewhere always cost something. "Drink this." A wooden cup was pressed against her cracked lips. Alice tried to turn her head away, but a calloused hand forced her jaw open. A hot, bitter liquid poured over her tongue. It tasted like willow bark and iron. She choked, sputtering, but swallowed it down out of pure reflex. The woman leaning over her was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face mapped by deep lines and a jagged scar that pulled at the corner of her mouth. She wore a heavy leather tunic over a woolen dress. There was no pity in her eyes, only a clinical, weary efficiency. "Where am I?" Alice croaked. Her throat felt like it had been scoured with sand. "Hearthglen," the woman said, pulling the heavy furs back up to Alice's chin. "The High Keep of the Wintermark. You're lucky to have toes, girl. Another hour in that drift, and we would have been amputating them." Alice shifted beneath the mountain of furs. She was naked. The heat radiating from the bedding was intense, supplemented by a massive stone hearth across the room, where a fire roared like a caged beast. The bed itself was large enough to sleep six, carved from heavy dark oak. Memory rushed back in a violent wave. The locked door, the snow, the massive black wolf tearing itself apart in the moonlight to reveal a man made of scars and ice-blue eyes. "Gideon," she whispered. The name tasted dangerous on her tongue. The woman paused, a wet cloth hovering over a basin of steaming water. Her posture stiffened. "You will call him the Alpha King, or your grace. Never his given name, not unless he commands it." "He carried me," Alice said, the absurdity of the fact still warring with her practical mind. "Why?" The woman wrung out the cloth with sharp, violent twists. "That is not for me to say. I am Fenna. I patch the bleeding and set the bones. The king's mind is his own." Fenna stepped closer, wiping the sweat and grime from Alice's forehead. "But I will tell you this. He has never brought a human through the gates of Hearthglen, let alone carried one in his own arms wrapped in his own mantle. You've upset the order of things, little bird, and wolves do not like it when the order changes." Alice closed her eyes. The bitter tea was working quickly, dulling the burning in her limbs to a manageable ache. She let out a long, ragged sigh. "I didn't ask to be brought here. I was just trying to find a shed to die in." Fenna let out a dry, humorless bark of laughter. "Survival isn't a choice here. It's a mandate. Now sleep. Your blood is still too cold." Fenna turned and left the room, the heavy oak door shutting behind her with a solid thud. Alice was left alone in the stifling heat. She stared at the fire. The flames danced and twisted, casting long, monstrous shadows against the stone walls. She was in the heart of the beast's den, a human in a fortress of monsters. Her cynical mind immediately began tallying the odds of survival, weighing her usefulness against her vulnerability. She had no dowry, no skills beyond scrubbing floors, and stretching thin barley into stew, and no family to ransom her. She was worthless, and yet the king of the Wintermark had claimed her. Alice drifted into an exhausted, feverish sleep, waiting for the catch. When Alice woke again, the pain had receded to a stiff, aching soreness. The fire had burned down to a mound of glowing red embers, casting the vast stone chamber in deep shadows. She was not alone. He was sitting in a high-backed wooden chair by the hearth. He wasn't naked this time. He wore dark, heavy trousers and a tunic of boiled leather unlaced at the throat, revealing the thick lattice of white scars across his chest. He was perfectly still, staring into the embers, but the sheer physical presence of him filled the room. The air felt heavier around him. Alice pushed herself up against the pillows, clutching the heavy furs to her chest. The rustle of the bedding sounded deafening in the quiet room. Gideon didn't turn his head. "The pain is fading," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Alice said. Her voice was steadier now, though it still carried a raspy edge. "Fenner gave me something bitter. Willow bark and wolfsbane heavily diluted." Gideon replied, finally turning his ice-blue gaze upon her. "It forces the blood back into the dying tissue. It hurts, but it saves the flesh." He stood up. The movement was fluid, completely at odds with his massive bruising frame. He walked toward the bed. Alice instinctively pushed herself back against the heavy carved headboard, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the furs. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the physical boundary she had just drawn. His eyes tracked her movement, calculating, assessing. "You did not beg them to open the door," he said quietly. Alice frowned. "You were watching. My scouts patrol the ridge. They smelled the human despair. They found you standing in the snow. They sent word through the howl. I came. Why didn't you just let them eat me?" Alice asked, the bluntness of the question a defense mechanism. "I was half dead. It would have saved you a trip." Gideon's jaw tightened. A low, barely audible rumble vibrated in his chest. "I do not scavenge, and my pack does not eat what belongs to me. I don't belong to anyone." Alice snapped back, surprising herself with the venom in her voice. "My brother made that perfectly clear when he locked the bolt. Your brother, Gideon, said the word dripping with an ancient, terrifying contempt, is a coward who hoards grain and sacrifices his blood to the frost. He is a weak male. A weak male creates a dying pack. I do not care what he made clear. I care about what is true." He reached out. Alice tensed, but he merely caught the edge of the heavy fur blanket, pulling it slightly to ensure her shoulders were covered against the chill of the room. His knuckles brushed her collarbone. His skin was still impossibly fiercely hot. "You stood in the snow." Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "You did not scream. You did not weep. You calculated your odds, turned your back on the fire, and walked into the dark because you decided you would rather die on your feet than freeze on your knees." He leaned in closer, his ice-blue eyes pinning her in place. "That is not prey, Alice. That is a survivor. That is a queen." Alice let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. "A queen. Look at me. I'm a half-starved bastard from a rotting village. I have dirt permanently ground into my knees from scrubbing floors. I don't know the first thing about courts or royalty." "Good," Gideon said flatly. "Human courts are dens of smiling vipers. I have no use for a silk-draped noblewoman who faints at the smell of blood. I rule beasts, Alice. I rule predators. They do not respect crowns. They respect strength. They respect the will to endure." He pulled back, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "The Wintermark is dying. The cold grows longer every year. The prey is scarce. My pack fractures. They need an anchor. They need an alpha female who understands what it means to starve and what it takes to live anyway. My blood recognized yours in the snow." Alice stared at him. He wasn't talking about love. He wasn't spinning a fairy tale about destiny or star-crossed romance. He was talking about cold, brutal pragmatism, He was talking about survival. He was offering a transaction, and that was something Alice understood perfectly. "So I am to be a symbol," she said slowly, testing the weight of the idea. "A breeding sow for your line, and a hardened mascot for your wolves." Gideon's eyes flashed dangerously. The air in the room suddenly smelled of ozone and hot copper, the pre-shift scent she remembered from the woods. "Do not reduce yourself to livestock." He snarled a true, terrifying sound that made her heart pound against her ribs. "You are my mate. You will sit at my right hand. You will eat the best of the kill. You will command the wolves of the Wintermark, and they will bare their throats to you. Or I will slaughter them myself." He took a deep breath, reining in the beast. The scent of ozone faded, replaced by the smell of wood smoke. "But there is a price for the fire I give you." Alice's cynical armor slammed back into place. "Here it is. There always is. What's the butcher's bill, King Gideon? Your past?" he said simply. "To be the mother of the Wintermark, you can have no ties to the humans who throw their own to the ice. Ironridge is a rot on my border. I tolerate them because they are insignificant, but they have offended me." Alice felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What are you going to do?" Gideon turned his back to her, looking out the narrow arched window into the dark courtyard below. "I am leaving within the hour. The vanguard is already assembled. I will tear the doors off their hinges. I will drag Garrett and Catelyn into the snow, and I will let them see what it feels like to stand on the wrong side of the timber." He looked back at her over his shoulder. The ice in his eyes was absolute. "Do you ask for their mercy?" Alice sat frozen. She pictured the cottage. She pictured the heavy oak door. She pictured Catelyn's sneer and Garrett's pathetic, guilty silence. They had condemned her to a slow, agonizing death just to save a few bowls of barley. They hadn't hesitated. If she asked for mercy, she proved herself weak. She proved herself the weeping human he claimed he didn't want. But if she condemned them, she became the monster they always told her she was. Alice met the king's gaze. She didn't flinch. "Catelyn will hide in the root cellar." Alice said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of any emotion. "The lock is broken on the inside. You have to kick the lower left plank to open it. Don't let her stall. She hides a hunting knife in her apron." Gideon stared at her for a long, heavy moment. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face, bearing white teeth. It was a look of pure predatory pride. "As you command, my queen," he murmured. He gave a slight, formal bow, the irony entirely lost in the genuine respect of the gesture, and walked out of the room. The weight was worse than the cold. Alice sat by the narrow window, wrapped in the heavy, dark fur Gideon had given her in the woods. Outside, the blizzard had broken, leaving behind a brutally clear, frozen night. The moon was a brilliant, hard silver disk illuminating the courtyard of Hearthglen. The stronghold was an architectural nightmare, a jagged collection of heavy black stone and thick timber built directly into the side of a sheer mountain cliff. It didn't look constructed. It looked carved out by claws. Below her window, the courtyard was a hive of controlled, lethal activity. Dozens of massive wolves milled about. Some were entirely human men and women, clothed in heavy leathers and furs, sharpening iron blades on grinding wheels. Others were in their shifted forms, massive beasts of grey, brown, and black, pacing the snow with restless energy. The silence of it was unnerving. There was no shouting, no chaotic barking, just the low hum of deadly intent. Then Gideon emerged from the great hall. He had shed the leather tunic. He stood bare-chested in the freezing air, a massive battle-axe resting casually on his shoulder. He let out a single sharp whistle. The courtyard froze. Every eye, human and beast alike, locked onto him. He didn't give a speech. He simply pointed his axe toward the southern gates, towards the ridge, toward Ironridge. In unison, the human soldiers dropped to their hands and knees. The sound of wet tearing and bone cracking echoed off the stone walls, a horrific symphony of transformation that Alice forced herself to watch. Within seconds, a pack of 50 enormous wolves stood where the men and women had been. Gideon threw his axe to a waiting guard, dropped to his knees, and let the beast consume him. The transformation was just as violent as she remembered, ending with the colossal black wolf standing at the head of the pack. He threw his massive head back and let out a howl that shook the very foundations of the keep. The pack answered a mournful, terrifying sound that tore through the quiet night. Then they surged forward, a dark, unstoppable tide, flowing out of the gates and disappearing into the snowy timberline. Alice pulled the fur tighter around her shoulders. She was alone in the quiet keep. Fenner entered the room an hour later, carrying a tray of thick venison stew and a loaf of dark bread. She set it on the table near the fire. "Eat," Fenner commanded gently. The hostility from earlier was gone, replaced by a cautious, wary respect. "You will need your strength for when they return." "How long will it take?" Alice asked, not moving from the window. "To cover the distance half the night." "To do the work." Fenner paused. "Only minutes. A village built of rotting wood and starving men is no match for the king's vanguard." Alice finally turned away from the glass. She walked to the table and picked up the wooden spoon. She took a bite of the stew. It was rich hot and seasoned with salt and thyme. It was the best thing she had eaten in her entire life. She took another bite, swallowing past the heavy lump in her throat. "You feel guilty," Fenner observed, watching her closely. "I feel—" Alice searched for the word. "Complicit. I handed them over." "You survived," Fenner corrected her, pulling up a stool. "In the Wintermark, morality is a luxury of the warm. When you are starving, there is only the living and the dead. Your family chose to make you the dead. The king simply reversed the roles. Do not weep for wolves who try to bite you." "I'm not weeping," Alice said, her voice hard. She took another bite of the stew. "I just want to know what happens when there's nothing left of my past. When Ironridge is gone, what am I to him then, just a pet he keeps by the fire?" Fenner leaned forward, her scarred face serious. "You do not understand what happened in the woods, child. The king did not bring you here out of pity. He brought you here because his beast recognized your soul. You are his mate. He will rip the world apart to keep you warm, but he will also expect you to stand beside him in the blood." Fenner stood up and moved towards the door. "Rest, Alice. Tomorrow you will not be a village bastard. Tomorrow the pack will smell the king's mark on you, and they will test you to see if you are worthy of it." The door clicked shut. Alice finished the stew in silence. She lay back down in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling. The warmth of the room, the food in her belly, the heavy furs, it was everything she had ever desperately prayed for while shivering in her thin woolen dress at Ironridge. But as she closed her eyes, she didn't feel safe. She felt the heavy, terrifying weight of the crown settling onto her brow. She had traded the cold cruelty of a locked door for the boiling, violent devotion of a monster. Miles away through the blizzard, she imagined she could hear the screaming. She imagined the heavy oak door of her childhood home splintering under the weight of a massive black paw. She imagined Catelyn cowering in the cellar, clutching a useless hunting knife, waiting for the shadows to come alive. Alice pulled the furs over her ears. She did not shed a single tear. They returned just before dawn. Alice knew they were coming long before the heavy oak gates of Hearthglen groaned open. She felt it in the floorboards. A low, rhythmic tremor that travelled up through the stone foundations, the collective footfalls of 50 massive predators returning from a slaughter. She stood by the window, the heavy fur cloak wrapped tightly around her. The sky was the bruised purple-grey of an impending morning, the air still violently cold. When the vanguard spilled into the courtyard, there was no triumphant howling. There was only the grim, exhausted silence of executioners finishing a shift. The snow in the courtyard was quickly trampled into a muddy grey slush. Many of the wolves were already shifting back into their human forms before they even reached the armory, their naked bodies steaming in the freezing air. They were covered in dark smears of ash and drying blood. None of them looked injured. It hadn't been a battle. It had been a demolition. Alice scanned the throng until she found him. Gideon didn't bother shifting in the courtyard. The colossal black wolf trotted slowly through the center of the pack, its sheer mass parting the crowd like a ship breaking black water. He looked up. Across the distance through the thick, freezing air, his ice-blue eyes found her window. A heavy, jagged breath rattled in Alice's chest. The cynical, hardened part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive in Ironridge, expected to feel horror. She expected to look at the beast and see the blood of her brother on its jaws and feel a paralyzing guilt. She didn't. She felt nothing but a terrifying, absolute safety. A few minutes later, the heavy oak door of her chamber opened. Gideon stepped inside. He had shifted back to his human form and wore a pair of rough canvas trousers, his broad chest bare and smeared with soot. His dark hair clung to his forehead, damp with melting snow and sweat. He smelled of smoke, raw ozone, and the distinct coppery tang of fresh blood. He didn't speak. He walked across the stone floor, his heavy footfalls the only sound in the quiet room. He stopped 2 feet from her, his massive frame blocking out the pale light from the window. He held out his right hand. Alice looked down. Clutched in his massive, blood-stained fist was a thick black iron bolt. It was the bolt from the door, the one Garrett had slid into place to seal her fate. It was twisted and bent, nearly in half warped by the sheer crushing force of a monstrous jaw. Gideon opened his hand. The iron bolt hit the stone floor with a sharp, heavy clang that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "The door is gone," Gideon said. His voice was a raw, gravelly rumble, exhausted, but thrumming with dangerous energy. "The roof is ash. The walls are kindling. The grain is scattered to the wind." Alice stared at the twisted metal at his feet. "And the people, those who stayed inside the cottages, were left alone," Gideon replied flatly. "I do not slaughter the innocent for the sins of the guilty, but the ones who resided in the house of the locked door, they are no more." He didn't elaborate. He didn't describe Catalin's face when the cellar door was ripped away, or Garrett's cowardice when the wolves circled him in the snow. He didn't need to. The finality in his voice was absolute. Alice slowly looked up from the iron bolt, meeting his ice-blue gaze. "Thank you." It was a quiet admission, stripped of any pretense. She was a monster by proxy now, and she accepted it. Gideon's expression softened, the hard lines of his jaw relaxing. The terrifying alpha vanished, replaced by a man looking at his mate. He reached out his thumb, gently wiping a stray tear that Alice hadn't even realized was falling. His skin was as always burning hot. "Get dressed," he murmured, his hand lingering on her cheek. "The blood is spilled, the debt is paid, but my pack smells the human in my keep, and they are restless. It is time they meet the queen who commands my teeth." The great hall of Hearthglen was a cavernous space of black stone and roaring hearths. When Gideon led Alice through the heavy double doors, the noise hit her like a physical blow. Over 100 wolves, mostly in their human forms, crowded the long wooden tables. They were tearing into roasted meat with their bare hands, laughing loudly, arguing, and drinking thick, dark ale from horn cups. The moment Gideon stepped over the threshold, the hall went dead silent. It wasn't a slow taper of noise. It was instantaneous. Every head snapped toward the entrance, every eye locked onto the king. And then their gazes shifted slightly to the right landing on the small, pale human woman standing beside him. Alice was wearing a dress of deep crimson wool that Fenner had procured, lined with silver fox fur at the collar and cuffs. She looked like a drop of fresh blood against the dark, imposing stone of the keep. She kept her chin high. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face remained a mask of cynical, bored indifference. She let her eyes drift over the crowd, meeting the glowing, predatory stares of the pack without blinking. Gideon didn't hold her hand. He didn't coddle her. He simply walked towards the high table at the head of the hall, expecting her to follow. As they moved through the aisle, the pack parted for them. The smell of the room was overwhelming wet fur roasting fat stale ale, and the sharp, undeniable scent of suspicion. They reached the high table. Gideon took his seat in a massive chair carved from the skull of a mammoth. He gestured to the smaller, equally imposing chair beside him. Alice sat down. Before anyone could speak, a massive man stood up from a table near the front. He was heavily scarred, his left ear missing entirely, his beard braided with bits of bone. "My king!" the man rumbled. His voice was deep, carrying effortlessly through the silent hall. "You ride out in the dead of night. You risk the vanguard. You bring ash and blood back to our doorstep. And for what a human—" He spat the word onto the rush-covered floor. "She has no fangs. She has no claws. She will freeze before the deep winter sets in." Gideon didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, a dark, dangerous amusement flickering in his eyes. He didn't answer. He turned his head and looked at Alice. It's a test, she realized instantly. He won't fight this battle for me. If I am to be their queen, I have to prove I am not prey. Alice slowly stood up. She looked down at the scarred man. She didn't raise her voice, but in the dead silence of the hall her words were sharp and clear. "What is your name?" she asked. The man sneered. "Torin, Vanguard Commander." "Well, Torin," Alice said smoothly, leaning her hands flat on the heavy oak table. "You are entirely correct. I do not have fangs. I do not have claws." She let her gaze sweep over the hall, taking in the bruised, battered, and starving state of the pack. "But I have something none of you seem to possess the ability to count." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Torin's face darkened in anger. "Watch your tongue, human. Look at yourselves." Alice snapped her cynical edge, slicing through the tension. "You are apex predators, yet you are starving. I walked through your courtyard. I saw your storehouses. You have 36 deer carcasses rotting in the lower cellars because you piled them too close to the hot springs. You are eating the prime cuts of meat tonight, while your young and your old fight over scraps in the lower quarters." She locked eyes with Torin, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute authority. "You rely on the king to hunt for you, to bleed for you, and to think for you. You act like mindless beasts waiting for the slaughter. I survived in a village that squeezed life out of frozen dirt, while you squander an entire mountain of resources. I don't need fangs to keep you alive, Torin. I just need you to shut your mouth and listen when I tell you how to survive." The silence that followed was suffocating. Torin's hands clenched into fists. He looked at Gideon, waiting for the Alpha to strike the disrespectful human down. Gideon was smiling. It was a terrifying, feral grin that bared his teeth. He picked up his horn of ale, raised it slightly toward Alice, and took a long drink. Torin deflated. He bowed his head respectfully, not to Gideon, but to Alice, and slowly sat back down. The pack erupted into a chaotic symphony of howling, table-thumping, and roaring laughter. The tension snapped. They didn't respect weakness, but they profoundly respected a spine of iron. The human had stood in the den of wolves, looked the Vanguard Commander in the eye, and called him an idiot. She was psychotic. They loved her. Gideon leaned over, his lips brushing against Alice's ear. "You are colder than the snow, little bird." He whispered, his breath sending a shiver down her spine. "Someone has to be—" Alice replied, her hands shaking slightly under the table where no one could see. "Now pass me the meat. I'm starving." The deep winter did not loosen its grip on the mountains for 3 brutal, sunless months. True to her word, Alice took over the logistics of Hearthglen. She abandoned the heavy crimson wool Fenner had initially found for her, trading it for layered, cured leather, thick canvas trousers and heavy boots lined with rabbit fur. She spent her days in the sprawling, freezing underbelly of the keep. The cellars were a labyrinth of dark stone, smelling intensely of blood frost and decaying marrow. She was merciless. Alice applied the cruel, starving mathematics of Ironridge to a fortress of supernatural predators. On her third day in the cellars, she found Torrin hacking a prime haunch of venison to pieces for the Vanguard's midday meal. Alice stepped into his space, grabbed the heavy iron cleaver from his massive, scarred hand, and slammed it into the wooden block. "You eat the flank today," she ordered, her voice flat, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the meat locker. "You take the neck meat and the marrow bones, and you boil them for the nursing females in the lower dens." Torrin towered over her. He let out a low, vibrating growl that vibrated the dust off the ceiling beams. "The Vanguard patrols the perimeter. We bleed in the snow. We eat the prime muscle. You eat what I tell you to eat," Alice replied, not taking a single step back. She picked up a chunk of rock salt and began rubbing it fiercely into the exposed meat Torrin had abandoned. The coarse salt stung the raw, cracked skin of her knuckles, but she didn't wince. "If you eat the prime muscle now, the fat spoils by the next moon. If the nursing females don't get the marrow, their milk dries up. If the pups die, the pack shrinks. If the pack shrinks, you don't have enough men to patrol the perimeter next winter. Do the math, Torrin, or step aside so I can find a Vanguard commander who can count past 10. Torrin stared at her, his amber eyes flashing. For a second, the beast in him weighed the option of snapping her neck. But he looked at the cold, unimpressed deadness in her eyes. He smelled no fear, only intense irritation. He picked up the flank, and the heavy sack of marrow bones bowed his head stiffly and walked out of the cellar. She stopped the rot. She catalogued every bushel of dried root, every barrel of salted fish, and every carcass dragged in from the timber line. She instituted strict rationing. The older wolves grumbled. The younger, aggressive males snapped their jaws and complained. But when the second moon of the deep freeze passed the time when the oldest usually wandered off into the snow to die, and the weakest pups quietly stopped breathing, not a single member of the Wintermark perished. Alice was not a maternal queen. She did not coddle them. She walked through the lower dens with a slate and chalk, checking the condition of the meat stores and ignoring the territorial posturing of the beasts. But the pack saw the results. They saw the full bellies of their young. They realized she wasn't just hoarding, she was building a fortress out of flesh and bone. They stopped growling when she walked past. They started lowering their heads. Her relationship with Gideon evolved in the quiet, firelit hours of the night, far away from the eyes of the pack. There was no grand poetic romance. Gideon did not sing to her or recite flowery vows. Their bond was a brutal, practical thing forged in mutual respect and a fierce, possessive intimacy. He was her furnace. In a world entirely defined by ice and stone, his sheer physical heat became her sanctuary. Every night she would return to the high chamber, exhausted, smelling of rock salt and dried blood, her fingers stiff with cold. And every night, Gideon was there. He would take her frozen hands in his massive, burning palms, working the warmth back into her joints until the ache subsided. She learned the map of his violence. She learned the story behind the jagged claw marks across his ribs, the smooth burn scar on his left shoulder, the thick white lines on his back. In return, he learned the exact pitch of her breathing. He learned the subtle tightening of her jaw that meant she was anxious, and the heavy, slow blink of her eyes that meant her cynical armor was finally lowering for the night. He didn't interfere with her rule. He watched her tear Torrin down in the great hall. He watched her threaten a massive dire wolf with starvation if he didn't share his kill with the elders, and he smiled. He was the sword of the Wintermark, but Alice had become the shield. The heavy iron bolt from the door at Ironridge sat on the stone table beside their bed. It was a grounding object, a permanent reminder of the transaction they had made. She had traded her past for a crown, and he had burned her past to ashes to claim her. Then, near the end of the third month, the wind finally stopped howling. Alice woke to an unfamiliar silence. The constant shrieking rattle of the heavy wooden shutters had ceased. The room was bathed in the pale, cold light of a full moon. The massive bed was empty beside her, the sheets still radiating Gideon's immense body heat. She sat up, wrapping the heavy black wolf pelt cloak tightly around her shoulders, and walked toward the archway leading to the balcony. Gideon stood by the stone parapet. He was entirely naked, the freezing air rolling off his burning skin in faint wisps of steam. He was staring out over the jagged peaks of the valley, his hands resting flat on the freezing stone. Alice stepped out onto the balcony. The air was sharp, biting at her cheeks, but the oppressive, crushing weight of the deep winter was gone. She walked up beside him, leaning her elbows on the cold stone. "You're going to freeze your bare ass off," she noted dryly, staring out at the monochrome landscape. Gideon let out a low rumble of amusement in his chest. He didn't turn his head. "Listen." Alice held her breath. At first she heard nothing but the absolute stillness of the mountains. But then a sound echoed up from the valley floor far below. It was a sharp, explosive crack, followed by a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to vibrate through the bedrock itself. It sounded like a massive spine snapping in the dark. "The frozen river," she whispered. "The thaw," Gideon corrected softly. He finally turned to look at her. The harsh, predatory lines of his face were softened by the moonlight. He reached out, wrapping a massive, impossibly hot arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The contrast of his burning skin against the chilled fur of her cloak sent a violent shiver down her spine. He anchored her to him, his chin resting heavily on the top of her head. "When I found you in the snow," Gideon murmured, his voice a low vibration against her collarbone, "I thought you were a dying thing. I thought I was carrying a ghost back to my keep." "I was a ghost," Alice admitted quietly, her eyes tracking another massive fissure appearing in the ice field miles below. "Garrett killed me the moment he dropped that iron bolt. I just hadn't stopped breathing yet." Gideon's arm tightened around her waist. And now, Alice thought of the packed storehouses. She thought of the pups in the lower dens, fat and warm. She thought of Torin bowing his head, and the heavy iron bolt sitting uselessly on her bedside table. She wasn't the half-starved girl in the spun wool dress anymore. She was the one who held the leash of the Alpha King, not by force, but by the sheer undeniable gravity of her will. She turned her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of smoke, ozone, and pine. "Now," Alice said, listening to the slow, thunderous beat of his heart. "Now I think I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." Gideon smiled, a terrifying, beautiful expression that belonged only to her. He tilted her chin up, his ice-blue eyes burning with a fierce, possessive fire in the dark, and kissed her. It tasted of winter air and absolute devotion. Far below them in the deep woods, a lone wolf howled at the cracking ice. The pack answered a massive chorus of wild, untamed voices, welcoming the end of the frost, singing for the king who brought the fire and the human queen who finally taught them how to survive. "The thaw has come to Hearthglen, but the reign of the Alpha King and his calculating queen is just beginning. What did you think of Alice's ruthless logic in the Great Hall? Did she prove that brains can dominate brawn even in a pack of werewolves? If you loved this deep dive into the brutal, grounded romance of the Wintermark, smash that like button and share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our dark, immersive storytelling. Leave a comment below. If you were thrown to the wolves, would you try to run, or would you figure out how to lead the pack? See you in the next tale.